Good evening, friends, and thank you for joining us for this special live stream presentation this evening here from Church of the Savior. It is such a joy to be with you this evening. I'm really excited to bring this conversation to you, although I'm not as excited for the impetus that's bringing that conversation. As we know, anti-Semitism is on the rise here as well as around the country and around the world, and that has precipitated this conversation. So our conversation this evening, we're titling Translate Hate, a conversation about anti-Semitism, and this is part of a wider effort that we're making here at Church of the Savior. As an intentionally anti-racist congregation, a logical connection for us was also to be good neighbors to our many Jewish neighbors, our friends all around us, and to make a commitment to combating anti-Semitism in every form that we can. So this conversation this evening is part of a much wider effort. Throughout the month of May, we're engaged in conversations with Jewish faith leaders here in the context of our worship services, but we wanted to take a little more time this evening to go in depth. And so I want to thank you for making time to be with us. For making this part of your evening tonight. Our guest this evening is Lisey Shapiro. Lisey is the Regional Director of American Jewish Committee Cleveland. She has become a very good friend of mine. She is also quite an impressive resume in terms of her background. She has a background in history and political science and in broadcast journalism, and Lisey has done a lot of commentating for major networks. She lived in New York for a while, was in New York actually during 9/11, and that's an important part of her story as well. We're so excited to have her here. Lisey and I became friends shortly after I came to Cleveland about 7 years ago, and that friendship has been really, I think, been a good one for us, both professionally and personally. I met with Lisey last fall sometime, I think it was last fall when we had lunch together, and we were talking about our visioning process here at Church of the Savior, and I wanted to get some input as we are doing kind of a 360 look at who are some of our partners, sort of connections with other people in the community. And AJC is one of those important partners, and I wanted to just learn from Lisey what they were working on, what their interests are, and she'll say a little bit more about the organization in a moment. But when she mentioned the work specifically that they do of combating anti-Semitism, that sort of piqued my interest, and we talked a little bit more about that. And I said, tell me more about what's going on right now that concerns you. And that conversation really is what led to our focus throughout this month as Lisey and I shaped those conversations together. Caused me to reach out to some of the other faith leaders who have been joining us, and I think it's been just an incredibly fruitful time. So I'm grateful that we're spending this time together this evening, and I'm grateful that Lisey is here to share with us. And so she's going to present some information to us. I think it's going to be really informative for us. Then she and I are going to sit down for a conversation, just kind of one-on-one conversation to dig into some of the stories a little bit more. And then we have an opportunity for you to share some questions for Lisey this evening. And we'll put a link up on the screen in a while, but be thinking about that. If you have some questions that you'd like me to ask Lisey that we can share back with you, that would be great. We've already received a couple of those in advance, and looking forward to hearing more of your questions. All right, but before we begin, will you join me in prayer? Oh, great and eternal God, we are so grateful for the opportunities that we have to make relationships, to love one another. We know that you have called us to be loving in every relationship, not just with those who are like us in terms of our background, in terms of our religious practice, in terms of our skin color or our attitudes, but to be good neighbors to all of our neighbors. We thank you for the love that calls us together, for the shared faith tradition that Jews and Christians hold as well, and we thank you for bringing us into this space where we can grow and learn together. I ask your blessing upon our presenter this evening, upon everyone who's participating by watching online. And I ask, God, that you will expand our hearts and our minds to love you more fully and to love one another as you have called us to do. This I ask in your eternal and precious name. Amen. Lisey, welcome. We are so excited to hear from you. Welcome to Church of the Savior again.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you, Reverend Call. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. Although I wish we were all together, it is certainly a pleasure to be with you. I come to you this evening with a very heavy heart and much gratitude. heavy heart because of the events of this week, both in New York and here closer to home, and in gratitude that you have gone on this vision and that you have gone on this path to take a look at anti-Semitism, to learn about anti-Semitism. And I am so grateful for my friendship with Reverend Call and his family and with this church. As a friend and a partner and a neighbor, I am so grateful for the opportunity to have this very important conversation with you. It is a difficult time. And what you will see is that what happened in Buffalo and what happened here at home this week are all intertwined. Before we get into the tough stuff, I want to tell you about my extraordinary organization that I am so blessed to be working with. The American Jewish Committee is the leading global Jewish advocacy organization. We are sometimes referred to as the State Department of the Jewish people. We have 24 regional offices, including ours here in Northeast Ohio, 13 international offices, including our most recently opened in the UAE, 37 partnerships with Jewish communities around the world, and numerous content institutions. This large global architecture allows us to impact policy and opinion on the important issues of the day, including our priorities, which are combating anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, securing Israel's place among nations, and defending and promoting pluralism and democratic values. And I should add that we are a nonpartisan, tend to be centrist organization, and we are about policy and not politics. So this evening, we're going to explore anti-Semitism, the oldest of hatreds. It's at times easy to understand, and yet it is so very complex, complicated, and has changed over the years. I'm going to share a bit about the state of anti-Semitism today, its sources and manifestations, how best to understand it and define it so that we can better combat it. I want you to understand that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is a deep hatred, and it is an attack on our very values and the values of our country. For many years, we Jews were complacent here in America. Anti-Semitism was something that we saw over there, that we saw in Europe, not here. But then Charlottesville happened with the chants of "Jews shall not replace us," followed by the massacre at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. These served as a clarion call, a wake-up call for American Jews that was followed quickly by Poway, Muncie, Brooklyn, as well as incidents across our communities closer to home in University Heights, in Elyria, Columbus, including yesterday and today. Today, Jews make up just 2% of the American population, and yet anti-Jewish crimes represent 1 out of every 12 hate crimes that happen in America in 2020. And almost 60% of all religiously based hate crime is against Jews. According to a recent audit by the ADL, in 2021, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States increased by 34% from the previous year. It has been a watershed year, and not in a good way. HAC's 2021 State of Anti-Semitism report contains 2 parallel surveys, one of Jewish Americans and one of the general public. that tells us about these groups' experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism in America. We use this survey to enlighten, to educate like this evening, and as the basis of our data-driven advocacy. I want to share some of the key findings with you. I'm a recovering statistician. Actually not a statistician, a pollster. So this number floored me, but it shouldn't surprise any of us. A vast majority of American Jews, 90%, you don't get 90% on anything, believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States today. However, only 60% of our neighbors believe so, with 25% believing that anti-Semitism is not a problem in our country. There is a disconnect. 82% of Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased over the past 5 years. And think about what I said about Pittsburgh, Colleyville, Poway, and all of the others that you've heard about. Americans are half as likely to agree at 44% that it has increased. In the past year, 1 in 4 American Jews have been the target of anti-Semitism. 24% of American Jews have been the personal target of an anti-Semitic physical attack, a remark in person, or a remark or post that they have seen online or through social media. And in the past 5 years, again, almost 25% of American Jews indicate that a Jewish institution that they are affiliated with, a synagogue, a school, a JCC, has been the target of an attack. And we are not just experiencing anti-Semitism in a vacuum. Remember I said it's all of our problem. Well, 41% of Americans report that they have witnessed an anti-Semitic incident or a remark against a Jewish person or institution. Strikingly, American Jews are changing their behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism. In the last year, almost 40% of American Jews have avoided at least one of 3 behaviors out of fear of anti-Semitism. They have avoided certain places, events, or situations. They've avoided making themselves visually identifiable as a Jew. And they have refrained, or we have refrained, from posting Jewish-related content online. Many Americans today are not familiar with the term anti-Semitism. 1 in 3 say that they are not familiar with the term. They've either never heard of it or they heard about it, but they weren't sure what it means. Now, although we're going to come back to this later as a tool, let's look at part of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and keep it in mind as we move on to the sources of anti-Semitism. I'm going to read it even though you should be seeing it on your screen. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. So anti-Semitism is not just Jew hatred, but also a certain perception which plays in to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, before we move on, I also want to say that there is greater awareness today. There's education and understanding on anti-Semitism. There's Holocaust education. And we see it in your leadership in taking this on, in our elected officials, civic leaders, faith partners, and in our neighbors. So let's talk about the sources and manifestations of anti-Semitism. Again, it is the oldest hatred, one that has changed over time. It is blatant and it is insidious. Jews have been vilified as inferior, and yet at the same time also perceived as superior. It's sometimes referred to as being punched up and punched down. And anti-Semitism comes from a multitude of sources. We know that we need to be swivel-headed and to be equal opportunity in condemning and calling out and denouncing anti-Semitism. It comes from the far right, white nationalism, neo-Nazism, and conspiracy theories. In this case, we are viewed as inferior. It comes from the far left, where we are seen as being powerful and privileged and the oppressors, and when anti-Israel or anti-Zionism crosses a line. It also, mostly in Europe, comes from religious extremism. And lately, we have added another source, ignorance and hatred. This anti-Semitism manifests itself in numerous ways through both word, which we call tropes, and action, including violence. It happens in person. It happens online. It happens in the media. And it is aimed at individuals, at groups, and at institutions. I think that you have all seen our booklet, Translate Hate, the name of this session this evening, which is a glossary that aims to better explain what those tropes and those words mean, how they can be used to be anti-Semitic, including those that show a hatred towards Jews, stereotyping and scapegoating, Holocaust denial and Holocaust comparison, and inappropriately invoking Israel and holding all Jews responsible for the actions of the Israeli government. I want to take a moment here just to speak about the rise in extremism, white supremacy, conspiracy theory, and violence. Today's deep political polarization has impacted the growth of extremism. Symbols matter. Words matter. And these movements have gained supporters. They have come out of the woodwork and gone down deep. It has grown hatred and spawned violence. Over the past few days, we've heard much about the Great Replacement theory, which is a conspiracy that believes the white race is under the threat of extinction. The conspiracy blames Jews for being the mastermind or the puppeteers behind the plan. All non-whites, including African Americans, Hispanics, immigrants, people of color, and Jews, are among the targets of the same expression of hatred. The Great Replacement theory has been cited as the motivation for the violence and is the through line from those chants in Charlottesville, the killings in Christchurch, El Paso, the incident in Colleyville, and now in Buffalo. Former FBI Director Christopher Wray indicated that at-home domestic terrorism was the greatest threat for our nation. And just this afternoon, I read a piece that said, according to a 2021 study of right-wing domestic terrorist attacks from the 1980s onward, the Global Network on Extremism and Technology found that in every case, the perpetrators believed in at least one Jewish conspiracy theory. In his manifesto to explain the attack, the Buffalo shooting suspect blamed Jews for pushing out whites and accused Jews of believing that they are superior because they call themselves God's chosen people. Why attack immigrants when the Jews are the issue, he asked rhetorically. His answer, they can be dealt with in time. My heart hurts, my soul hurts, that there is so much hatred in the world. I also want to take just a moment to speak briefly about Israel, as there are often questions about whether or not criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. And I will admit that it is complicated. Political protests are an essential part of a thriving democracy. Criticism of Israel and Israeli policies, similar to that leveled here in our country and in other democracies, is perfectly acceptable. In fact, in Israel, you will find robust criticism of the government, a government that includes Arab and Muslim members of the parliament in the ruling coalition. However, when Jews are held responsible and are targeted and attacked for Israeli policies and actions, that's anti-Semitism. And when Israel alone, as the only Jewish state, is being singled out, one out of 193 countries at the United Nations, and it alone is being criticized, then you need to wonder if there is underlying anti-Semitism. We often speak about the 3 Ds in determining whether criticizing Israel is acceptable or if it crosses a line of anti-Semitism. And that's demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. I think that for now, I'm going to leave that, and we may come back to it another time. And I want to get to, I'm running out of time. I want to get to some of the tools and action steps in order to combat anti-Semitism. And again, we need to understand it and define it in order to combat it. So one tool is the Translate Hate Glossary, where you can look and see if something is anti-Semitic, something that you hear. But in addition, there is a working definition. It is the International Holocaust Alliance, Remembrance Alliance working definition. It has been adopted by 37 countries, the US State Department and the Department of Education, 26 states, including our own state of Ohio, and numerous municipalities, universities, organizations, and corporations. It allows us, you saw probably half of the verbiage of the definition, but within the definition, there are 11 or so examples of what constitutes. And it is not enforceable. It is a tool to be used to better help organizations, law enforcement, to see if something is anti-Semitic or not. The other thing that I would say is that it's important that we have allies. We can't do this alone. We are stronger when we are together. And we encourage you to fight anti-Semitism when you see it, and to fight all hatred as you see it. That's easier said than done sometimes. So what are the actions that you can take? I encourage you to realize that anti-Semitism is not always a physical manifestation or a violent attack. It's not always graffiti. It can be more conspicuous. It can be tropes and dog whistles, conspiracy, or it can be more insidious. When you see it, call it out, report it. Ask your friends and neighbors, what do they think about it? Teach your children not to hate. Anti-Semitism is a modern problem. It is often said that it is a canary in a coal mine, the first of hatreds. It will not be the last. And again, I emphasize that it is not a problem for Jews, but an attack on our democracy and our very values. I thank you. I look forward to your questions. The importance of this series that you are having, a month devoted to this, is so important, and we are so grateful, for we know that we are stronger when we are together, and together we are stronger than the forces and the hate that will try to divide us. Thank you. She tries not to fall.
Right, yeah. Watch your step. We gave you a nice obstacle course to work your way around here. Lisey, I want to thank you for that. I mean, what an incredible presentation. I have to tell you that when you read the excerpt of that manifesto that the Buffalo shooter wrote, it was chilling to me to hear, I mean, to say we can deal with them later. And we know, I mean, for instance, in the course of the investigation, the sheriff has told us that his intent was to move on. I mean, he wasn't done. Right. His intent on that day was to shoot as many black people as he could, his stated intent. And I apologize for the violence in that statement. But his intent was to do more harm. Right. And I think he was inspired by others who came before him, and his intent in leaving a manifesto was to inspire others who were going to come after him.
We know that he watched others that had been live streamed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was live streaming that attack himself.
He was live streaming.
Yeah.
He was in the dark corners of social media, of websites. I believe he said he was bored, and so he began investigating these and took it all in. And of course, we're learning more. We don't know, and I'm not, I'm not an expert on this, yeah. But we know that he became ingrained in these replacement conspiracy theories. Yeah. And something drove him from more than behind a computer screen to do violence. I will also tell you that I was in Columbus on Friday and Saturday, and I was teaching classes on anti-Semitism. And I was in the car on the way home, and I'm a news junkie, and yes, I play CNN sometimes instead of music in my car. And I was listening, and I found myself gripping the wheel. I was shaken to my core that this had happened. And immediately reached out to friends who I knew were pained by what had happened there.
Yeah. I think as we've been talking about this rise of anti-Semitic attacks, and there is something different in the air. I think you talked about Charlottesville and the Tree of Life synagogue shooting as being kind of the wake-up calls, and I think those of us who are paying attention are saying to ourselves, what's different? Something has happened, and so we're seeing increasingly these major events, these major issues where people are committing heinous crimes, terrible attacks, and so we're seeing that happen. But that's sort of like the extreme. That's the highest level. Right. There's a lot more that's behind that's going on behind the scenes, and it's the insidious, I think was a word you used, pervasive, that the sort of easy conversations that we're hearing around us now, people using these kinds of slurs and terms and thinking that somehow that's becoming, it seems like it's becoming a little bit more acceptable. Yeah, and it's deeply disturbing to me. We had the conversation when you and I were having coffee together yesterday about what would we do if we were sitting where we were and we heard somebody at the counter make a slur, to use some kind of a derogatory comment, and what would we do? I think those are really important questions for us to ask ourselves.
And they're hard.
Yeah.
Right? And they're hard in this time when you don't necessarily want to be confrontational. Now, I think I also shared a story with you that goes back pandemic time, but I was shopping at one of our local grocery stores. And someone who waited on me normally at the deli counter, if you will, of the grocery store, made a comment. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not sure what it was, but it was a derogatory term. And I thought, I can walk away from this, but this is what I do for a living. What am I supposed to do? And I said, I want you to know that what you said is very hurtful, and I'm going to walk away now. And she thought I was going to go tell her boss, and she was fearful and began to cry. And one of the other women that she works with who knows me came after me, and I said, I'm not interested in talking to her boss. I said, but I am interested in speaking with her because I'm going to guess that she doesn't know that what she said was offensive. I know her. I don't think that she meant this in an offensive way.
Okay.
I said, so if she'll talk to me for 5 minutes, we can probably straighten this out. And it is exactly what we did. And I made sure that the next time I was in the store, that she saw me, that I didn't wait for her not to be able to help me. If we don't teach and we don't use these as teaching moments, we're going to get more of the violence, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm saddened that, I mean, what a great story, and I appreciate your ability to be in that space. It's not an easy thing to do. Yeah, and I'm also saddened that somehow the onus is on you as the Jewish person to teach the person who says something like that. I mean, it shouldn't, it should, and it can't be just our Jewish friends who are the ones who bear that burden.
Right. I think that's true. I think that when you hear someone, if you hear the term someone say, oh, they Jewed me down,
Yeah.
I would say something.
Yeah.
If it's in a comfortable place to say something.
Right.
Or if you're not saying it back to that person, that you tell others that you heard this and you were disturbed by it.
Yeah, talk about it, because I mean, I think you cited the statistic that 1 in 3 Americans doesn't know what anti-Semitism is. My mind is blown by this, because first of all, I think, how is that possible?
Well,
and yet,
right. Okay. So, if you hear the term racism, you probably know what that is. But when you think about it, there are swaths of this country where people probably have never met a Jewish person, but they may know someone from television or the movies. Anti-Semitism is one of those hard terms, right? If we use the term Jew hatred, someone might understand it. The problem is that, as I said in that definition, it is not just shown as a hatred of a Jewish person. But yeah, it's frightening, and that's why I've chosen to add that additional category of where anti-Semitism comes from, right? From ignorance. And then when we know that especially in New York, my home, in the streets of Brooklyn and whatnot, there are Jews who have been beaten up for looking Jewish. Looking Jewish, not physically, but by wearing a kippah or something other identifiable. That's hatred. I mean, that's not being perpetrated by somebody who's got a deep feeling from the far left or the far right that we talk about. That's just hatred. So
xenophobia and things that, people that just acting out of ignorance. I want to talk about, because I think right now, I mean, you talked about how your heart is heavy, and I want to just acknowledge, and some people who are watching may not even fully be aware of the events just this week. So Monday there was a lacrosse match between Lake Catholic and Orange, and
high schools.
High school lacrosse match, and Orange local schools located in Pepper Pike, significant Jewish population.
And diverse.
Yeah, and a diverse population. Yes, not just. I mean, it's not a Jewish school. It just is a public school. Happens to have. And there was a boy on the field for Lake Catholic who had painted a swastika on the back of his leg.
And just think about what you said. He painted a swastika on the back of his leg.
First of all, weird
Well,
to paint.
yeah, but
you
I mean,
don't paint on the back of your leg
my guess-
accidentally.
and we think he drew it on. We don't
Yeah.
think it was a tattoo. I don't have all those details, but I bet he had help.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of a hard
an
place to
awkward
be able
place.
to do
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
yes, and I mentioned that symbols matter.
Yeah.
A swastika is representative of a Nazi regime that killed 6 million Jews.
Yeah.
It is a symbol that represents hate. It was an act of hate.
Yeah.
And it deeply saddens me.
And there's been in the reporting. I'm sorry. There's been in the reporting. There's been a lot of talk about this kid and what's going to happen to this kid and why was he allowed to play and he's going to be suspended and all. But it wasn't just that kid. It was, as we're hearing the stories from people who were there were slurs, chants, people saying things to the fans
saying words that my father, who was on the front line of World War II as a Jewish American man, thought his children would never hear, and those would be the ages of his grandchildren.
Yeah.
That they would never hear. Yes, there were slurs, and it breaks my heart, and it angers me, but it also gives us an opportunity
Right.
to educate.
Yeah.
And we need to react to these. You need your children to understand what happened the same way that you tell that same child, and it's hard to tell kids about it, but the same way that you tell them what happened in Buffalo.
Yeah.
And then there was a swastika painted on a sidewalk at Kent State
Yeah.
this week.
Right. Yeah, just that news just breaking today, but when it actually was painted, we don't know.
right.
But right on the sidewalk in front campus at Kent, and again, the sort of thing you think, what the heck?
Right.
I mean, why?
Why?
Why is that happening?
And if you put it in the context of knowing what happened in Buffalo, it hits harder.
Yeah.
Not that we wouldn't have been upset before. I mean, some of you may remember that there were swastikas that were painted on buildings in University Heights. This 2 years has sort of gone by. And like
We've all sort of lost some time during COVID.
But let's just call it fairly recently.
Yeah.
And so, I think that Holocaust education and education about the fact that we are much stronger through our diversity, we have much more in common than we have different, and we are stronger because of it, is just so important.
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned to you earlier that I would say it's fortuitous timing. I think perhaps it's more than fortuitous that we structured these conversations, that we're having the conversation we're having tonight
Right.
at a time right now when just this week, really close to, we're not talking about someplace else, even as close as Buffalo is. I mean, we're talking about our own community and just the urgency of this conversation. And by the way, I neglected to say this as we started, that to make sure we have the graphic on screen or the URL on screen. We want to include your questions in this too. So I think Jim and Evan are going to put up a slide, so you'll have that. So you'll find both the text of the link that you can use to submit questions, and there's a QR code on there. If you're nifty with this, you can grab your phone and snap that QR code.
We're so
We
there.
try. We're working on it. And so you can share those questions. I have them right here on my tablet as they're coming in, and it's really helpful. So we want to hear from you. Questions or comments that you want to make as we're continuing this conversation. But I just feel like God has led us into this conversation, into the relationships that we're having, and in the time that we're doing this. It just feels so necessary and so urgent for us to be having this conversation that we're having right now.
And again, we're so grateful that you're willing to have the conversation and that you're willing to look at yourselves and our community and talk about what we can do to make our world a little bit better. You know, we've talked about, when I was here before for service, which was so magnificently beautiful, this is a magnificent church. I'm in awe of this church. And yet this evening, I walked right in.
Yeah.
I don't get to do that at my synagogue. Sometimes there's a security car, and I thank them for sitting there. And when I go in, the building is usually locked. And I thank the armed guard that I've walked by. So I've thanked the armed guard. When you think about what happened in Colleyville, Texas, that happened again by someone who believed in conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
He believed that the Jews were powerful enough, and actually called a rabbi in New York to help him get someone released from jail, because we were all powerful. But the hostages escaped. They were not let go.
Right.
They escaped because they had had security training.
Yeah.
And you know what? I wonder if that church in California, whether or not they had had security training, because if I'm not mistaken, the minister threw a chair first.
Right.
And that's, you know, one of the barriers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
It's the climate is very different now than I think we ever hoped it would be. And the difference, as you said, between probably a naively open church and a synagogue that it would just be unthinkable to not have security presence at a synagogue in the climate. And it's sad, and it is immensely sad to me. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the power of story. I mean, we've talked about some of the news headlines and some of the other incidents. I know you also have some direct. I mean, you talked about your experience at Heinen's. You have some other incidents.
I said a grocery store, but yes.
Well, okay. Yeah, not to single out any
Yes.
particular grocery store. It could have happened in
It could
any
have been
grocery
anywhere.
store. It just happened to be that one particular local grocery store. But say a little bit more about some of those experiences that I don't think non-Jewish people recognize how pervasive and how frequent this kind of thing is. Is there a story or two you would want to share with us, whether it's yours or someone else's story?
I think one of the most powerful stories of recent year, you know, let me just back up a second and say, I grew up in a home where we did not talk about the Holocaust. My mother said she lived through it, she didn't need to talk about it. And my father, as I said, was on the front line. And yet, there were certain stories that I had heard about my mom's growing up and my dad's growing up, where my mother was chased down the street, and she was not only called the daughter of an immigrant, but you dirty Jew. And she heard that, and she grew up with that, and she wanted to make sure that her kids never had that as an issue. So I grew up knowing about anti-Semitism, but I didn't directly feel it as a kid. I went out to college and I met people who, I lived in a very diverse community in Connecticut. And I had many, many black friends, and if you weren't Italian, you were Jewish, kind of a community. And my parents had been active in the NAACP and all of those kinds of things. And I went out to school in Wisconsin, and it was the first time that I met people who had never met a Jewish person before. And that sort of floored me, because I came from the East Coast, and what did I know? So one of the more recent stories that I have found just so really goes through me is that our immediate past president of my organization here in Cleveland, she and her husband took a well-deserved vacation in California, and they were walking on a pier. He does not wear a yarmulke. She has very dark hair and blue eyes and is beautiful. And all of a sudden, they heard someone menacing them, and they heard the words, Jew, 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 and someone running after them with a broken bottle. And Rachel describes it as being the most heart-piercing sound, that she heard, that it just sent trembles through them, and they didn't know really what to do. And here she'd been so active with us and what to do, and she hesitated to report it.
And why did she hesitate to report it?
They were on vacation, and no harm was done, and in the end, they reported it.
Yeah, I'm glad they did.
I believe the person was arrested. But it came after another person from Cleveland who had a connection out, wasn't the same person, but in the same area. Something similar had happened to him. And he had a 6-month-old baby with him and was petrified. Wow. So there is this sense of fear. And as I said, when I saw the picture of the swastika today, it went right through me. It's very scary.
The resource that you mentioned it earlier, and you gave me a copy this months ago, Translate Hate.
Which is also lives online.
It does, and so I think
document.
if you have the email that I sent earlier today, just a reminder about this, you have the link in there for it, but it's very simple. It's ajc.org/translate hate. This is a great resource, and the glossary that goes through all of these terms and some things that you might not even recognize initially as terms that have anything to do with anti-Semitism, but then you start to read a little bit more about it. There's also a resource online. I think it's through the same link that there's a quiz about how did you score on this. And I took the quiz months ago, and I thought I'm going to do really well on this. I'm a faith leader. I live in a pretty diverse community. I know this stuff. I have all these great Jewish friends. I have lunch with one of my rabbi friends pretty regularly. I think I got a 6 or a 7 out of 10. I mean, I was shocked at how did I miss any of these? But it's because we're not tuned into it enough, and if we're not paying attention and learning and educating ourselves about it, it's really easy to miss some of these things.
Now, it is really easy to miss. Some of them are very obvious, right? I also, after several of the incidents that happened, the really horrific incidents that happened, Pittsburgh, Colleyville, you were one of the people who called and just said, I want you to know I'm thinking about you. Because what we know is that when one Jew, one institution is harmed, we are all harmed.
Yeah.
And you didn't need to say more than that. Just, I'm thinking about you.
Yeah.
I'm praying for you. And, after Pittsburgh, when we had, we've stood in solidarity too many times.
We have.
We've stood in solidarity when Sikhs were murdered for being Sikhs. We stood in solidarity when African Americans were killed in a church. We stood together after Pittsburgh. It's really important. We are very fortunate to live in the community that we live in, where we have forged really strong relationships. And as I said earlier, those relationships allow us to be stronger and to fight hate.
Right.
Because we need to fight hate.
Right. And it doesn't stop with any one community. I mean, that's part of why this initiative is so important for Church of the Savior, who has identified we are not going to stand by while this happens all around us. And for us, it began, the real charge for us was after George Floyd's murder, and why it took that many is still something we wrestle with, but we're there.
But you're there.
And so we're continuing in that, and we're saying, this isn't, we have to stand up to it. The famously quoted from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think, if I remember correctly, that was part of his letter from a Birmingham jail, which was a response to Christian pastors, mostly Christian pastors, who said, don't stir up trouble here in our city. You go back to to the north or wherever it is you're going to do this. And that was part of his teaching. And so part of what is so important to us about this work, whether it's with our African American neighbors, whether it's our Jewish neighbors, whether it's with our Muslim neighbors, our Hindu neighbors, it's just so important for us to speak out and to stay together in this. All right, I'm at risk of talking all night long.
And while you're looking at the questions, there are 2 bills. I don't know whether or not I can do an advocacy call.
Please do.
But the president called for the passage of a bill, and I have a note here somewhere about another one. But the No Hate bill is really important, and this may be the time when we can get it passed.
Yeah, that would be great. So as we're transitioning to this time, I want to remind you again, if you have questions that you want to share, ask of Lisey or of me, or just make a comment, add to the conversation. You can do that using the jot form that's there. I'm just refreshing it now, and well, I think I'm refreshing it. But we have some questions. Some people submitted ahead of time. Please use that tool, and we'll get to as many of them as we can over the next 10 to 15 minutes. So I want to start with a question that came in earlier from Tom, who talks about he grew up here in the Heights, and a few decades ago, and he went to Fairfax School, and he says, we had about 30% by his estimate of their classmates were Jewish, and he said for us it was sort of just so what? We're all stripes here, and he wants to know why. Now this seems like it's an even bigger problem. What's happened that's changed the dynamic?
That's a really hard, good question.
Yeah.
I think that we are living in a more polarized time. And let me just preface it again by saying my mother was chased down the street being called a dirty Jew. Maybe that didn't happen here, but it's not that there was not anti-Semitism before, or bigotry, or hatred, but it was more under the cover. And now, I think that the political polarization, I think that social media, I think the availability of being anonymous in many ways has probably led to it. I am not an expert on that, so it's my own opinion about it, but I would think that would be a part of it. I'd be interested to know whether or not Tom has any opinion as to why.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting. So Tom, would look forward to hearing from you on that. I think that's fascinating.
Don't you think?
I do think, and I'm also drawn to we talked about the normalization, the way that this has become more I think in over the last decade or so, Richard Spencer is sort of well known for his white
David
nationalism.
Duke.
David Duke before him, and we talk about some of that, but it's becoming so much more pervasive, and we've seen it as an undercurrent of political campaigns. We're seeing it now, and I'll name it. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'll name it that Tucker Carlson on Fox News repeats this replacement theory idea, and it seemingly without any he's acting with impunity. There's no consequence to his doing this, and that just emboldens more and more of this kind of talk. Just really disturbing to think about how this has become. That it's somehow tolerable that you can do this, and people aren't denouncing it.
There is a lot of denouncing.
But candidates who are profiting from this kind of talk aren't stepping up and saying, we're not going to have it. Some of them. I shouldn't say all of them, because there are people who are. You're right. It's just challenging.
And I think that we need to call out hatred at every level. One of the things that we do is to have conversations with faith leaders, civic leaders, community partners, and our elected officials to explain to them what anti-Semitism is. But in that same conversation, we're also talking about racism. Like you, we are all becoming much more aware of the hate-filled environment that we are living in, and trying to overcome all of that hatred.
Yeah, I think so. This probably plays off of this. So this Gordon sends a message. His spouse, Marcy, included the Holocaust Museum as part of their 8th grade Washington trip, which I think is great. And the question is, do you know how common that is for Cleveland area schools when they visit, when they go on their DC trip, to include the Holocaust Museum as part of their trip? It's a good question.
It's a great question. I don't know. I think that many of them do. But I would also say that there are great resources closer to home as well.
Right.
So
The
you have
Maltz
the Maltz
Museum is
Museum of
fantastic.
Jewish Heritage is great. There is if you're going down to Cincinnati, there's the Cincinnati Museum.
Yeah.
And there is more Holocaust education available. I will tell you that when the Holocaust Museum, and again, think about how I was raised, when the Holocaust Museum opened, I was in Washington shortly after it had opened, and I had gotten a ticket. And I was so moved by what I saw and what I felt, whether it was walking into the boxcar or the shoes. And I also had the privilege of being at Yad Vashem in Israel, which is the memorial in Israel. And I remember in that, thinking about, in both of those, just thinking about the horrors. And we've all, you grew up with the stories, so you knew. And walking, I went into the children's exhibit, if you will. That's not the right word. But the Children's Memorial in Yad Vashem. And it's all the lights that were, right? So it was all that was lost. And it's a very powerful moment. So your wife's trip is so meaningful. And look, there are these, the Maltz Museum does the no hate. I probably should know the name of the essay contest that they do.
Yeah.
But it's really important.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful that she's doing that.
It
I
is.
would bet
And I
that
think
a
we
lot
want
of
to encourage,
schools
I
do
mean, I
that.
hope other schools are doing that too. It's
I'm
a great
sure.
question.
And
I
there's
don't
also,
know.
the virtual,
Right.
being able to go.
So you and I talked about part of this conversation was we were going to get a little bit more and potentially get a little bit more into the Israel-Palestine relationship. And one of the things you and I have had really animated conversation about, shall we say, is BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. We decided before this evening, especially given the incidents of the last week, that we really needed to focus more on things that are closer to home around this. And I know that these things all are of a common cloth, but there are one or two questions in here dealing with kind of the Israel-Palestine issue and some other political nature of that. And I want to just acknowledge we're not glossing over any of that stuff. I mean, we simply, to open that conversation is going to require a longer period. And maybe we have a further ongoing conversation or panel about that.
Right.
I think there have been some really great talks. I went to one at the City Club a couple of years ago that was just fantastic. But I just want to say that we're not ignoring those, just that once we get into that, once we open that up,
It's a little bit longer.
it's a hard and nuanced conversation.
Right, it is. And again, the criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic. It is when you demonize, double standard, delegitimize, that it is crossing over, and anti-Zionism is crossing over. But it is a very complicated issue. And as you said, we're not glossing over it. It's just in the amount of time that we had.
Yeah.
A little bit difficult.
Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I want to acknowledge and just name it for what it is. So kind of coming off of that question around the school trips, somebody else asked, how do you address anti-Semitism with your children? And I think this is kind of addressing, this person specifically speaking about Jewish children. How do Jewish children learn to cope with the fear anti-Semitism evokes? I think the companion question that is, how do we teach non-Jewish children about anti-Semitism? And what do those conversations look like? It's a great question.
It's a great question, and I have to admit I am a non-parent, former teacher,
Right.
but a non-parent. we have all heard about the talk that African American families have with their children.
Mm-hmm.
Ours is a little bit different, and we have to acknowledge that it's different. It was inherent in my growing up that there were people who were not going to like me because I was Jewish.
Yeah.
I also felt a great responsibility to that, to not give people reason. It's a lot to put on a kid.
It is a lot,
But to not give someone reason to have those thoughts. And I think that as you teach children about hate, there are many forms of hate, and one of them is against people, against Jews, against Muslims, against blacks, against, so anti-Semitism is real and it exists. And when you hear someone say something, or when your children have Jewish friends, to learn about them as people. We are known as bridge builders, right? And you build bridges of understanding by sharing, and by sharing in your own custom. And I remember when I was here for a funeral to ask you what's proper, what's not proper.
Right.
We've shared a Passover Seder. We have shared other things. And I think that breaks down some of the stereotypes that happen. But it's also to be attuned to what you're hearing, so that when you hear someone say the word Jew down, or, oh, they run the media, that you have a response to it.
Yeah, or a joke, or just even the
Jokes.
Just even, yeah.
And slurs.
And slurs, right? Yeah. So by the way, somebody just made sure they shared with us that the essay contest at the Maltz is called "Stop the Hate."
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We appreciate that.
Thank you, because Dahlia and David would not be happy with me if they're watching.
You're going to hear about that. So there's a student from Orange High School who shared with us that they know the entire team. They also know the child. They knew the student. They know who the student is, and they know the student who had the swastika on his leg.
Oh, is that right?
That's a fascinating relationship.
I did not know that.
And I'm just going to read this because it's so beautifully written. This was disgusting, and the number of people needed for this to happen is horrible. It seems that this has become a battle of reputation, with neither school willing to do anything about it. That's interesting. I don't think that's entirely the case. I think the schools are actually, the administration's been pretty responsive to this.
Right. On both sides.
Yeah. Is there any way, though, that I think it's a question for you. Is there any way that you know of to provoke these folks to take action, not only to take action now, but to provide resources around changing the culture? I think that's a great question.
And in part, do we have a name?
We don't.
Student number one.
Right.
I think in part it is up to you to say to your administration and to your friends, before I answer that, let me just take a step back to say, my understanding, and mine is all coming from either people who are involved or secondary sources, that the young men on the Orange team handled it with grace and dignity, and that they were graceful in the end of the game and so forth. I do think that as a school, the administrators are aware. I think they've taken actions within the Orange school system, and the communication to parents has been great. But I think that a student group could say, we're not going to tolerate hate, and we saw hate, and we want to make sure that everybody here understands what that hate means and what that hate is.
Yeah, and I hope that's...
And I think it's happening at the other school.
That's what I was going to say. Is, again, like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, that it saddens me that it's not fair that the person who's being singled out and persecuted, marginalized, has to be the one to educate. and yet so often that is the case.
I think we will hear more.
I
think
hope we will
hear more.
Yeah, and I hope I think we may hear something from the diocese. I would hope they will. Okay.
They have put out a really beautiful statement.
And I think other faith leaders, I expect,
right.
need to speak about that as well. All right, really great questions tonight, and so appreciative of this. And I think I want to just, as with every one of these conversations, kind of end with this question: what can we do? So this was an earlier question, but I think it's a good one to end with tonight. What can we as Christians do about anti-Semitism when we respect Judaism and our Jewish friends and neighbors? So this is a person, I think the gist of this is, I have Jewish neighbors, I have Jewish friends, I have deep respect and love for my Jewish neighbors. How do I then take that beyond just my own attitude toward my neighbors into making a difference? How do Christian communities like ours begin to make a difference and move the needle?
I think that you've made a huge difference by having these sets of conversations, that you should be proud. I'm grateful. You should be proud of what you're doing and how you're addressing this. I think it's important that you keep the awareness up, that when you see something, when it's safe for you to do something, that you say something, that you make sure that you don't hear things. Now, if I were out in the stands and someone yelled some of the things that were yelled, I'm not sure that I would have been brave enough to say anything. So
and it might not have been constructive.
And it may not have been constructive at that point. But I think that in part it is knowing what anti-Semitism is, understanding it. I would say, because we are an advocacy organization, to work on the No Hate Act and some of the other provisions that are being used. You may, and again, not to put you on the spot, but you might want to take a look at the IHRA definition and say, this is something we are going to adopt so that we can recognize what it is. And I think, as I said, and it's a two-edge here, is it meant a great deal to me when there was an incident and you just checked in on me. I know that not everybody wants that, because there is times when you want to say, yeah, right, and where are we? Right? But the shining a light, enlightening, learning more about the Holocaust, learning more about hatred and about violence can only make us stronger. And I think as a Christian community, also learning about your neighbors, and you do that in the neighborhood, and you do it in the community, and you do it beyond the community. So I think you're doing it.
Well, I hope we are making a difference, and I hope we continue to do that. I think also one of the things about being a friend is that a real friend who loves their friend when they call, and to be able to sit in the space and let their friend lament and just vent out some of that anger is so important too.
The other thing is that when you don't understand something, if you have a friend, you can ask that person, why is this offensive?
Yeah.
Because there's certain things that you're like, I don't get that.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
And to be able to ask that question and to have the conversations. Look, we have had and we will continue to have tough discussions that may not be about anti-Semitism, but may be tougher for us. We may not agree on everything.
Right.
You don't need to agree on everything.
Sure, thank God. My circle of friends would be really small if I had to agree with everybody. Well, listen, I think this has been so helpful. I want to thank you, Lisey, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank Jim and Evan Leonard, who are running our tech for us this evening. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for everybody who's watching and for submitting your questions. Rabbi Joshua Caruso from Fairmount
That's
Temple is
awesome.
going to be our guest on Sunday. Great friend of both of ours, and we're looking forward to that. So thanks for joining us this evening. Make sure you check out Translate Hate. If you haven't already checked that out, we'll have some hard copies here. Lisey brought some with her. There's some in the
And if
building
there
we'll have
are
around,
questions.
and we can always have more of those as well. But check it out online, ajc.org/translate-hate.
And there's
Really a great
also,
resource.
on that website are a great number of resources about anti-Semitism. For example, today, there is one about replacement theory that really goes into replacement theory. So if you're interested in that, there are all kinds of things on the website.
Yeah, really important. I think that we just can't underscore that enough, the importance of educating ourselves, learning more about all this. You know, we're going to hear these terms, we're going to hear things go by and think, well, does that matter? I don't know what that is. Look, the more we learn, the better we can respond. So thank you just so much for being part of this. Thanks for being my friend and for sharing and being a friend of this congregation, and we're so excited. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.